Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Dr. Dupree, you want to go ahead and do roll call whenever you're ready?
Yes, sir. I'll begin with the board. Jason Burdine,
Here.
Allison Drew,
Here.
Addie Helliger,
Addie's going to be a little bit late.
okay, Grail James,
Here.
Jim Rice,
Here.
Dave Rosenthal,
Here.
and Kristen Tossan,
Here.
and staff, Deanna Saavedra,
Deanna Saavedra here.
Brian Gwynn,
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Anthony Indelicato,
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Beth Martinez,
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Oscar Perez,
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Long Pham,
Dupree, I'm here.
David Ryder,
I'm here, sir.
Joe Rodriguez,
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Robert Scamardo, Veronica Sofer,
Veronica Sofer here.
and Gwen Touche,
I'm here.
and is board counsel Rick Morris in attendance?
Here.
Here he is. All right, Mr. President, everybody here, with the exception of one staff member.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. It is 5:31 p.m. and this meeting is hereby called to order. We have the presence of a quorum attending on a video conference. Notice of this meeting has been posted online for at least 72 hours. On March 16th, 2020, Governor Greg Abbott granted a request by Attorney General Ken Paxton to temporarily suspend a limited number of open meeting laws to the extent necessary to allow telephonic or video conference meetings in response to the coronavirus COVID-19. In accordance with those suspended rules, Fort Bend ISD certifies the following. Although members of the board are not gathered in a central physical location, we do have a quorum in attendance at this meeting by video conference. This meeting is being held by video conference because the convening at one location of a quorum of the governmental body is not appropriate during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Based on current guidance from federal, state, and county authorities concerning large gatherings and social distancing during the COVID-19 public health emergency, there is no established location for an audience to observe the meeting. However, the live meeting is audible and accessible through a YouTube link that was timely and appropriately provided to the public and media as part of the meeting posting through a news release and via the district website. As we would at any in-person meeting, members of the public who have followed the standard instructions for registering to speak during the public comment portion will be allowed 3 minutes to speak. All other meeting procedures will adhere to board adopted procedures to the extent practicable. Even though this meeting is being live streamed on the district's website and on the district's YouTube channel, an audio and video recording of this meeting is being made and will be available to the public on the district's website. All right, Dr. Dupree, do we want to go ahead and start off with 2A?
Yes, sir. As you know, this evening, we're doing a public hearing on our tax rates. So Brian Gwynn, our CFO, is going to do a brief presentation before we take questions from the board. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Dupree, and I'll let Gary get things pulled up. But as I'm doing that, or as he's doing that, this evening, the district is conducting a public hearing for the tax rate for the 2020 tax year in accordance with state statute. The proposed tax rate supports the budget that was adopted by the Board of Trustees on June the 15th, which totaled $737.49 million in the general fund and $126.47 million in the debt service fund. And Gary, can you switch to the next slide, please? This is the first year that the tax rate is subject to compression calculations that were included as part of legislation enacted during the 86th legislative session through House Bills 3 and Senate Bill 2. And based on the new legislation, property value growth is capped at 2.5%. Next slide, please. Based on the certified tax roll received from the chief appraiser, the net taxable value grew by about 7.1% over the prior year. And because our growth rate exceeds the 2.5%, as I mentioned a moment ago, the tax rate will be subject to compression established by Senate Bill 2 and House Bill 3. Next slide, please. I'd like to briefly share a timeline of events around the tax rate. The district is on a July 1 fiscal year and must adopt the budget by June 30th based on statute. The district adopted the budget on June 15th and received the certified tax roll on July 22nd. And the tax rate was calculated using guidance by TASBO and our property tax attorneys, and that was released after the budget was adopted on June 15th. The district has submitted the compressed tax rate calculation with certified values to TEA as required. And on August 3rd, the district received notification that the calculations were approved by TEA. Next slide, please. Based on the certified tax roll and the guidance released by TASBO and the district's tax attorney, the tax rate is decreasing by 0.0298 cents. The maintenance and operation rate is being compressed by 0.0398 cents. And the income and sinking rate, which is used to pay on the district's debt service for new facilities and life cycle deficiencies, is increasing by 1 cent to 0.29 cents. Voters approved the 2018 bond referendum that contained a tax increase of 3 cents. And the tax rate last year was increased by 2 cents. And this penny represents the final increase associated with the 2018 bond. And also, I'd like to point out that the INS rate is not impacted by compression, as is the M&O rate. And I do want to also mention that the tax rate is not, although it's being reduced, it's not going to result in less revenue for the district. The reduction in property tax revenues will be offset by an increase in state aid. And again, that is part of House Bill 3 that was approved in the 86th legislative session. Next slide, please. Based on the new tax rate of 1.2402, the average tax bill will total $3,333.11. And that's based on an average taxable value of $268,756. And that is including homestead exemptions. This average tax bill amount is an increase of about $31.73 annually, or about $2.64 per month from the prior year tax bill. Next slide, please. In 2019 and 20, which is a prior tax year, the district maintained a low tax rate when compared to peer districts in the area. And this speaks to the district's ability to utilize taxpayer resources in an efficient manner. Considering the district's property value growth of 7.1% or 3.5% over the cap, the inherent tax rate compression, it's very likely that the total tax rate will remain among the lowest in the area. Although at this point, most districts have not adopted their tax rate, so we won't have those survey results until most districts adopt their tax rate. And since they're doing that most likely this week or this month, it will be at the end of this month when we have that data. Next slide, please. Before closing things out, I do want to provide an update on the impact COVID is having on the budget. From an enrollment perspective, we are reviewing enrollment to ensure that we understand the impact that the pandemic is having. And currently, we're about 2,900 students less in enrollment than what was projected by PASA. It's important to remember that there's always a substantial dip, but one thing that we're closely monitoring is that the return of students who were dropped for no-show is not occurring as quickly as it's occurred in years past. And right now, Student Affairs is actively working to engage with students that have had sporadic engagement since the start of school. And we've also re-engaged with CASA to assist with reaching out to students that were no-shows and that have not had any engagement at all. And you may recall that the initial contract that we had with CASA included a retention services in addition to the recruiting that they also do for us. We have about 35 days until the PEEM snapshot is taken for enrollment that's submitted to TA for funding purposes. And between now and that time, we'll be actively working internally and with CASA to impact our enrollment number so that we can ensure that we can do everything we can to ensure that we don't see a revenue impact associated with enrollment. On attendance, our current attendance rate is at 97%, and that compares to about 97.5% last year. Initially, we did have some errors in our initial attendance, and that was due to a learning curve associated with taking attendance in a remote setting. And some students were marked absent, but when the PEEMS attendance team reviewed the Schoology data, there was evidence that remote learning was occurring, so the students' attendance was corrected. And that corrected data is what will be reported to TEA for funding purposes. Next slide, please. Overall, the impact to our budget is still to be determined. However, we are in the process of tracking all COVID-related expenditures. And at the staffing level, we're in the process of evaluating the parent responses and building configurations to determine if there will be any staffing impact. But at this point, it's expected to be minimal. And if any adjustments are required to the budget due to staffing or other related expenditures, staff will bring forward an amendment to the board for consideration. I also want to point out that there are some federal funds available to assist with expenditures, and Fort Bend County has paid the district $789,000 from the $134 million in CARES Act funding that they've received, and that's been submitted, or which we've been paid to date. However, we are submitting additional requests for reimbursement that would include the wellness monitor and other eligible COVID expenditures that we've incurred that should be eligible for those expenditures as well. And once we have a full accounting of that, we'll report that information back to the board. However, I do want to point out that the County CARES Act funding does lapse at the end of December 31st unless it's extended through legislative action. And then finally, FEMA is also covering some expenditures through their public assistance program. They cover up to 75% of eligible expenditures spent on the pandemic response. And then the county has indicated that while they have the CARES Act funding, they are able to offset the 25% match for eligible governmental entities in the area, of which we are one of those. So we'll be submitting those 25% portion to the county for reimbursement through their CARES Act funding, as long as those funds are available. And I want to mention too, that in terms of FEMA, for at least personal protective equipment, they have indicated to us that there is an expiration date on that, and that September the 15th is the last date for which funding will be available for personal protective equipment through the public assistance portion of their funding. And that again will lapse as of tomorrow. However, we will be submitting all eligible expenditures through the 15th for personal protective equipment. And then, as you'll hear later this evening, we'll also be requesting for contact tracing to be reimbursed through the FEMA program as well. And that's the update on the budget. If you can go to the next slides, Gary. As it relates to the tax rate, the next steps in this will be on September 21st, we'll be bringing back the tax rate to the Board of Trustees, and that vote will occur at 6:00 p.m. and it will be a record vote. And if that concludes the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Gwynn. Do we have anyone on the board who would like to has any questions or comments, Mr. Rice?
Yes, thank you, President Burdine. Mr. Gwynn, thank you very much for the presentation. I just had a couple of questions. On average, how much does the state fund us per pupil?
Right now, the basic allotment is just over $6,100 per pupil.
$6,100. Okay, so Cases is actively engaged in reaching out to the students who haven't returned to school.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
All right. And what's the cutoff period for when we report this to the TEA?
The PEEM snapshot, it will occur on October 30th, which is the last Friday in October.
Okay. So here's my question, another follow-up question, Mr. Gwynn. Your slide showed that we had tax or appraised property values increased this year over 7%. And we are only able to take advantage of 2.5% of that growth. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Now, how does am I correct in understanding that House Bill 3, the legislature said will make up the difference if that happens? Is that right?
Yes, sir. So the way that House Bill 3 is structured is that any growth above the 2.5%, the state, and I'll caveat that by saying, so long as they have funds available, will make that difference up. But that is how it is written in House Bill 3.
Yeah. So they made that law 2 years ago when they had money, and now 60% of the state's revenue comes from sales tax, and the sales tax has been negatively impacted. But they've got to pass a 24-month budget, and they had the funds to pay to make up the difference this year. What happens next year if the tax revenue hasn't increased? Will they be able to pay that, or will they be will they dip into the rainy day fund, or is that the $64 question?
Well, that may be the $64 billion, $6.4 billion question. At this point, the state has options. They have not indicated what that funding will look like. The state controller has indicated that at least for the current biennium, they're expecting about a $4.5 billion shortfall in the budget. And as it relates to that, he has indicated that there will be no change to funding for education in this biennium. However, they've made no such statements regarding funding for the upcoming biennium. And so that's an area where we obviously have great concern, and we'll be watching and listening very closely in the next legislative session as it relates to funding for schools.
Hence the reason for your creating a conservative budget, knowing that going into this. And I think that was very wise to do. I'm saying these questions primarily for our folks at home to understand this. Because if the state doesn't have the money, and if they don't have enough money in the rainy day fund, or if they don't want to use the rainy day fund, that doesn't leave us a whole lot of room to maneuver unless we were looking at a TRE next year, not this year, next year. So knowing also that House Bill 3 moved the Comptroller's Property Tax Division, who would provide these values, these finalized values to us 12 months in arrears, and now the TEA is doing it in real time. Did that happen? Did that occur this year? And if so, was it a smooth process?
From what we can see at this point, the answer to that question is yes. And again, that impacted all districts. So the switch from prior year values to current year values is complete. And as best we can tell, that has been a seamless transition, although we were initially concerned about what that would look like.
Yeah, that's good to know. That really answers my questions, Mr. Gwynn. Thank you very much. Very good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Rice. We appreciate it. Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine, and thank you, Mr. Gwynn, for a very informative presentation. And thank you, Mr. Rice, for asking those questions, because this next legislative session is going to be very interesting to follow how school funding is going to be handled after the results of the pandemic and the financial forecasting not looking so good. I wanted to follow up, Mr. Gwynn, on one of your last slides that had to do with the attendance rates and the assumptions that we made around that. And did I understand? So our attendance is a little bit low, but not so out of line with how we've started school in the past. What seems to be different is that the rate of the kids coming back to school, or re-enrolling, if you will, after having been dropped, is a little bit slower. And so did I understand that you guys are going to be monitoring this and updating us and bringing more information forward, or how would we expect, what happens next, I guess?
So at this point, there are two things that are occurring in our review of the data. So I want to first say that what you indicated is correct. What we are seeing is every year we administratively drop students who don't attend the first day of school. And although that occurred a little later this year than it did in prior years, that process still occurred. And typically what we see after the first day of school is a gradual return to regular enrollment. And by the time we hit Payne Snapshot, we are either at or above our PASA projection. This year, we're seeing a return of students, and last week was the first week where we saw a consistent day-over-day increase in the number of students attending, although it was not to the scale that we normally see. So as we've looked at this over the past and seen the sporadic trends this year, we made a determination that a couple of things needed to happen. We have students who are enrolled but engaging sporadically in online learning, and those students are going to be targeted by our Student Affairs Department. We also have students who have been unenrolled or dropped and have had no engagement. And specifically around those, we'll have CASA reach out because they have the network support in order to do that and attempt to get those students re-engaged. As we start to see those, we can report back to the board on what those trends look like. Although typically I would say it would not be on a weekly basis because sometimes you see a large increase and then the following week it may drop off. But we can report back to the board on what our enrollment increases look like over time.
Okay, I think that sounds good. And maybe that would connect also, Mr. Gwen, I think you mentioned this, and this would be maybe more towards Dr. Dupree, but probably will connect also as we get the new master schedules built and the staffing ratios figured out and what that's going to look like. All of those things maybe will come together more clearly in October. Is that what you're thinking?
That's exactly right. A lot of moving pieces right now.
Okay, well, that's great. I appreciate you keeping us up to date because I was a little concerned about if we're having trouble connecting with kids and they're not in attendance, then we don't get paid for them or get recognized for them by the state. And so I just wanted to be sure that we were addressing that early because this is a very unusual situation.
It is, and Brian may have mentioned this, but I did want to reinforce, this is a statewide trend that all the superintendents were worried going into this year about enrollment drop. And so we're thankful that TEA provided some cushion. But, in our reality, in our diverse international community, we know that under the circumstances, it's likely some of our students have just disappeared back to another country with family while their parents are working here. And so that's the challenge we're having because we generally have good data when they go to other districts or to charter schools or other places, but there's just a void for many of our students that are just off, they're just gone. And so it really is a unique challenge for us. I think largely because of our international community, we're not sure where all the students could be.
Dr. Dupree, if I may add one thing, Mrs. Gar-James, we have gotten 1 or 2 requests from, say, the Philippines and also from India to allow the kids who are residing there to get back into our Schoology and Teams. Because what we have done is that we have blocked certain country that's we don't normally, I guess, communicate with. And as we find out these students, we start allowing them back in their credential to come back into our firewall.
Okay, so that's interesting. So we have some of our students are working remotely in the extreme.
From different countries.
Yeah, from different countries. Okay, so I agree with you that our multicultural demographic might impact it a little bit differently than some other places. So thank you for bringing that up and thanks for that information. Appreciate the report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Did any other board member have a question or comment? All right. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Gwynn. Thank you for all the information. We appreciate it. Next is going to be our speakers, which no one signed up to speak this evening. So with that being said, may I have a motion to adjourn this meeting? And then at 6 o'clock sharp, we will start our regular board meeting. May I have a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
May I have a second?
Kristen seconded it.
Okay, second. We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mrs. Tossan. This meeting is now adjourned. See you at 6 o'clock.